So hi everybody. I'm kind of sad I don't have my backup music anymore. My name is Brandon Morrison, and I'm going to talk to you guys about online mapping today. But before we get into that, I want to share a story with you. Meet John Snow and Henry Whitehead. You're probably asking yourself, why are these two old dudes on the monitor when we're talking about online mapping? Well, these guys lived in London in the 1850s, and there's a few things you need to know about living in London at the time. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. It was one of the first cities on the planet that had a population of more than 1 million people. And as I'm sure that if you've lived in a large city like Atlanta, you probably know that there are probably some infrastructure considerations and challenges that happen when you try to cram that many people into that small of a space. And because London was one of the first cities to do this, they hadn't really figured out things like public health very well yet. So if you lived in a city like this, or if you lived in London at the time, you were likely to get sick a lot. Another thing that you need to know about living in London in the 1850s is that our understanding of how people actually get sick hadn't really evolved to the point of us understanding things like germ theory. So we didn't really know why. I mean, we kind of knew why people got sick, that if you had one sick person next to another, the other person would get sick eventually probably. But we didn't really have a good mental model for how that worked yet. Germ theory wouldn't be a widely accepted theory for another 30 years when we actually had microscopes strong enough to actually see the viruses and bacteria that actually get us sick. So living in London at the time was actually kind of scary because you would have like neighbors and friends and family who would just kind of like get sick and drop dead without any real warning, and that's not really a great way to live. At the time, because of all the public health issues and that kind of thing, London in the 1850s had a really bad set of cholera outbreaks. One particularly bad one happened in 1854 in a neighborhood where both Snow and Whitehead live. Snow is the gentleman on the right. He was what you would consider today a modern version of a public health official. And then Henry Whitehead on the left was a minister who lived in the neighborhood that kind of worked with people day to day. And they saw that all these people in their neighborhood were getting sick and dying of cholera. And they were like, well, we need to stop this. How do we figure it out? So they did what any good investigative reporter would do, and they went and they knocked door to door on every neighbor, or on every door in the neighborhood, asking family members and people who knew the victims why, what were they doing before they got sick? And they were looking for a common thread. And so they gathered a lot of information, and what they did with that, or what John Snow ended up doing with that, was creating this. This is the cholera map of 1854, or the Broad Street cholera map of 1854. What this tells us, like any regular map, you have the streets and everything, and the bars represent the number of deaths in a particular household. So if you'll notice this area here, there are lots of long bars coming from each of those places. So they decided, they were looking at that area and they're like, well, something is affecting the people right in this block, or people that live right on this block, on this street, on Broad Street, were being affected by cholera a lot more than anyone else. And in the course of the investigation, they found out that a lot of the people who were getting sick were drinking water from this particular water pump, which my mouse is highlighting over right now. So what they did was they shut down the pump, and within a few days, the rates of cholera outbreaks dropped dramatically. So they had found their source. One way that they actually knew that it was the water pump and not just people like have something in the air or something like that. This building right over here is a monastery where lots of people lived, but no one got sick. And the reason no one got sick was because they brewed their own beer and they drank that instead of the water. So if you don't get anything else from this talk, if you drink beer, you're probably not going to die of cholera. So, yay, alcoholism. Anyway. So what's really cool about this map in general is that it's a really important artifact in not only in medical investigation, but for people who discuss and do data visualization as well. It's an early attempt at sharing complex information in a more tangible form so that you can kind of step back and see, okay, this is what this giant pile of information is telling me. It is definitely a strong legacy for us as information gatherers and storytellers today. Today, instead of making paper maps, we tend to share our stories and stuff online. And so what we're going to talk about today are a few different methods that you can use to share similar types of stories, or just to share like geospatial types of information online through a variety of different tools, both Drupal-based and not. So if you want to follow along at home, this is a short URL that has a blog post that I wrote about it. Those are capital I's and not L's. So it's bit.ly/169, capital I, 5, capital I, lowercase n. And if that doesn't work, try them as L's, but I'm pretty sure they're I's. So the first, just kind of quickly going through it, the first module we're going to talk a little bit about is geofield. Geofield is who has not heard of the geofield module? Awesome, I love talking about this module. So geofield is a field level module for Drupal. It's available for Drupal 7, and what it does really well is that it stores geospatial information. And what I mean by that is it can store a point on a coordinate system. So a point would be like a particular address point. So 57 latitude, negative 46 longitude. Which would put you in like South America somewhere, I think. It will store lines, so if you happen to be like a trail runner and you want to follow, like a particular path that you're running on, or if you want to trace things like flight paths and that sort of thing, we can store that sort of information. And we can also store polygons, and so polygons are basically just enclosed lines that define an area. So if you wanted to do things like county boundaries, state boundaries, that sort of thing. We can store all of that type of information with geofield. And because we store it in a common format called WKT, which is short for well-known text, we have a lot of flexibility in how we can actually present that data, both just internally to Drupal and to other external services. If you've worked with any kind of geographical information system or a GIS system, WKT is, and its cousin WKB, which is basically a shortened, like a compressed version of that, are kind of the de facto standard for how you store this kinds of information, and there are lots of good tools for working with that. Geofield, as it comes bundled with Drupal, has a few different ways that you can give information to it. By itself, you can input raw geospatial data as raw, well-known text. You can provide it as GeoJSON, which is another data format for storing geospatial information that basically does the same thing as WKT. But because it's in a JSON format, it's a lot more flexible for if you're working in like a JavaScript setup. We have in the new version of geofield, which we released about a month ago, we have a really nice input widget that does HTML5 geolocation for you. So you open up your browser, you say find me, and it says, okay, you're here. And then you'll have that information that you can drop in. And those are all well and good, and those work out really well. If we're talking about ways to get data out of geofield or to display that information, we actually have a very wide variety of data displays. We have, again, you can do just the raw output of WKT and GeoJSON. We can also export KML snippets. KML is the data format for things like Google Earth. So if you tie that into views in an XML display, you can spit out KML files and spit that into Google Earth, which is pretty cool. GPX, which is like if you ever work with like a dedicated GPS unit, that's kind of the industry file format for that. What else do we have? We have a geohash. Geohashing, or a geohash is It's a really interesting string that you use a lot in Solar instances whenever you want to do proximity searches. The way that it's formatted, it makes it really, really fast to do proximity searches across a large amount of data. And if anybody has questions about how that works, I'm happy to talk about that after after the presentation. But the short version is it does it's a way to do quick proximity searches, and so we expose that data if you want. And outside of just those different text formats that we have available, we also tie into a lot of different modules. We tie into the feeds module, so you can import geospatial data very easily through various types of feeds. We have really good integration with the microdata and RDF modules. So if you want to expose your information or your geospatial information that way to external applications, I haven't really fully grokked how that works yet, but it sounds really cool in theory. So we have integration with that. We have really good integration with the Apache Solar module, so that if you want to do Solar searches, that's a really cool way to do that. And views, we also have really good views integration as well. And then I'll talk about a few extra modules that do more things with views at a little bit later. Geofield itself also comes bundled with a very basic Google-based map formatter so that you can display your geofield data on a Google map. We don't have a map input that comes bundled with geofield, but there are some modules that I'll talk about in a little bit that do that for you if you need that kind of functionality. So the short version of that is geofield basically handles data storage when you're talking about geospatial.
But usually you just hide it because you don't want to show it. This is kind of nerd information that real people don't want to see.
Right. Yeah, so the question is that you usually actually hide that like geospatial information, and you use that to populate other displays. And that's definitely accurate. You probably are not going to display your geohash or your latitude, longitude point, but you probably are going to display it on a map, or you're going to display it or have it as a way to filter on things. Yeah, no, I didn't take offense, so I can't speak for everyone else, but yeah. So if we're talking about data storage, you need to have a good way to actually input that data into geofield. Most people that are working with geospatial data, they're not going to say, oh, well, I happen to live at 41 - 86. They're going to say, well, I live at South Bend, Indiana, or Washington, D.C., or Atlanta, Georgia, or wherever. And so they will have an address that they can actually go to. That's where the geocoder module comes in. So what geocoder does is it translates address strings from like 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to actual coordinates that we can store with geofield. The way that it handles this is it ties into a variety of external data services. The primary one that you'll probably use is the Google geocoder. It is easily the most robust solution, but they also have geocoder also ties into a few other services as well. You can tie into Bing. You used to be able to tie into Yahoo until they closed theirs. There are a few other specialty services. And then geocoder actually has a couple of other extra really cool tricks as well. So for example, geocoder can pull geospatial information from various files that have that kind of information embedded in it. So the basic example is like if you upload a KML file that you export out of Google Earth, we can import that. So you would set up your file field as a KML file. You would point geocoder to say, hey, pull your geospatial information from geofield, and then that loads into the actual database. The more interesting applications of this is that if you have a camera that tags your photos with geospatial information, like your iPhone or your Android phone, you can pull that information out of that file. So you can actually just upload your photos into a Drupal site, do your geocoding on that, and then all of a sudden your Drupal site now knows where all of your photos were taken, which I think is kind of cool. There's another good example. Oh, if you ever do like GPS tracking files as well, you can also import that as well. Do you have a question? Or no? Okay. Cool. So one thing to note about Geocoder, the module as it currently stands, whenever you're dealing with geocoding, like external geocoding services, they tend to rate limit. Google's is actually particularly brutal, and where they will only allow something along the range of 2,500 hits per IP address per day. And the distinction there is that the per IP address part. Geocoder, as it currently stands, only does server-side geocoding, which means that unless you have a particularly eccentric web hosting setup, all of your requests are going to be coming from one IP address. The way that Google typically tells you that you should do geocoding is client side, so that it happens all through JavaScript. And so that means that each individual user has their own bottle of 2,500 hits per day, which they're not likely to hit unless you're just constantly pinging them for whatever reason. So that is something to keep in mind when you do geocoding through this particular module. This is something that I kind of want to get fixed sooner than later because it's not great. But
so is there a JavaScript solution for geocoding?
The question is there a JavaScript solution for geocoding? And there's not one that ties into the Drupal ecosystem very well currently. I actually just open sourced a library about a month ago called geocoder-js on GitHub. So if you Google that, that's kind of it's a port of a geocoding library that's originally in PHP that I also want to move geocoder to use eventually. But my long-term goal for that is to get this module to use those two libraries, which would enable us to do JavaScript stuff. So if there are any developers here that would like to help with that, we are always looking for that kind of work. So I know I'm going a little fast. Is there any questions or anything so far before? Yes, sir.
What is the underlying data storage in geocoder? Like I've looked in my tables and I see like Latin long. Is there anything else that's going on under the scenes, or is it just like a big interface to store the Latin long address?
Sure. So the question is what is the data storage for geocoder? What does that look like in the database? Geocoder does not actually store anything in the database. What it does is it passes information to either geofield, which is kind of the primary module that does the storage on that. It also ties into another module called geolocation, which does the same sort of thing. But the short version is that geocoder will only pass its information to other field storage modules. So you don't actually have anything from geocoder in your database. Anything else that I can cover real quick? Sweet. So I skipped a slide. This is the list of providers that we have. MapQuest is another really good provider, by the way. They're still alive in 2013, which is amazing. But you know, Phoenix from the ashes, I guess. But yeah, it's really cool. They are. I would use MapQuest as like the second choice after Google, you know, on a given project. They tend to have better terms of service, and they also tie into a lot of OpenStreetMap data, which is pretty awesome as well. So. So far we've been talking about how to get geospatial information into Drupal, but especially if you've paid attention to any of the commerce talks today, a lot of the thoughts on how Drupal works inside of an ecosystem, you also need to get information out of Drupal. You know, it's one thing to have Drupal run all of your things, and you know, if you have a relatively simple site, that's great. But if you want to go to a different tool but still manage your content through Drupal, how would you do that? The Views GeoJSON module is a really good tool for spitting out geospatial information from Drupal. Basically, what it allows you to do is to create a view that will format itself as GeoJSON. So GeoJSON is like I was saying earlier, a geospatial specific data format of JSON. And then it also has a few other cool tricks. Like it allows you to expose like a bounding box filter on all of your data searches so that you can say, show me all the geospatial features that are within this particular block on the map versus just giving me everything in the database. And so by exposing it in the way that it does through arguments, it ties in really well with some other good external tools for retrieving that geospatial information. Views GeoJSON in general could use a little developer love as well. So as I'm going through these, I'm pointing out anything that if you, again, are an entrepreneurial developer that wants to get your name out in Drupal, here's another awesome place that you can kind of poke in. But yeah, so Views GeoJSON is a really cool, is a good way to get that information out of Drupal into external systems. And because it's tied into views, anything that you can do to views, you can do through this as well. So that makes it a very flexible tool. So if we're talking about so we've talked about how to put data into Drupal, geospatial data into Drupal, and we've talked about how to spit it out. Let's get to the fun part. You want to be able to display that in an interesting map display. The long-standing way to do that in Drupal is the Openlayers module. So Openlayers is actually two different entities when we talk about it in the Drupal ecosystem. There is the Openlayers JavaScript library, which is a Slippy map. So Slippy map is basically like a Google map. So it's the engine that actually runs the map itself. And so Openlayers is an open source implementation of a Slippy map interface. So it allows you to show various different types of layers. It allows for basic interaction with that. There are lots of plugins to do all kinds of interesting things within the data's display of that. Openlayers, the module, is an integration module with the Openlayers library that ties into views and a few other things to actually be able to create maps based off of Drupal data. So where it shines is that it's a little heavy as a module, specifically because it does tie into the views ecosystem, and that occasionally gets a little cumbersome. If you used it in Drupal 6 and you haven't in 7 yet, I would recommend checking it out in 7 because it's come a long way in the last few years. But it still has like this weird model where when you create a map you don't just create a map, you create a map display and then a data display, and then you have to point the data display to the map. And it's a little clunky. But it does work, and it's fairly stable, and because it's been around for a while, there's a lot of good tutorials and a lot of good integration points into the Openlayers module. But if you want the new hotness, the leaflet module and JavaScript library are kind of where a lot of the cool kids are playing now. So Leaflet, the JavaScript library, it's another open source Slippy map implementation. It's much lighter weight. It uses a little bit more of a modern architecture for handling its plugin system and that kind of thing. It also uses a lot of, it uses all the buzzwords basically. It uses CSS3 for doing a lot of its sliding and stuff, which makes it a lot more mobile friendly. It actually does, out of the box, attempt to be mobile friendly in the first place. So it's a really nice JavaScript library to work with. And then there's the Leaflet integration module, which is, it's definitely a module and it definitely exists. And I personally like the Openlayers module better because I feel like it's a little bit more configurable. And I feel like the leaflet module is slightly more buggy in a few places. The way that the leaflet module defines a map is basically through a hook alter and then a giant array of doom. And that gets tricky to debug. So that's, I mean, people make it work, and if you want something a lot more lightweight, it's definitely something to check out. Every time I've ever done a leaflet implementation with Drupal, I've actually just hard-coded all the JavaScript stuff myself because I found that was personally easier, but your mileage may vary in that. So the leaflet module itself, definitely check it out, see what you can do with it. Some nice tools that do come with the leaflet module. There's a additional module called Leaflet Draw, which allows you to do a map input for geofield. And so that's definitely a really nice piece for that. So there's a Leaflet Draw plugin as well, which is allows you to put like points and polygons and that sort of thing onto a map. And it's a really nice interface, and it works really well. Let's see. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the Drupal side of the discussion. Are there any questions or anything that I can answer about?
So I've been looking at the IP geolocation
Mm-hmm.
mapping thing. What do you think about that? 'Cause that seemed like it was like both of these put together somewhat.
Yeah, so the question was that there was specifically about the IP geolocation module and how it kind of fits into this ecosystem. I haven't personally used it. I've heard good things about it, and that it does kind of fit on top of Leaflet to do some interesting. It adds a few extra layers to the Leaflet integration, and then it also I think it does an input widget for geofield as well, but don't quote me on that. I should probably know the answer to that, but anyway. One thing to note about all of this as well is that the Drupal ecosystem for doing mapping is actually a lot bigger than the like 7 or 8 modules that I'm showing here. I tend to focus on these, A, because I maintain half of them, so I kind of like them, but B, they also work really well together. One module that I name-checked earlier, the geolocation module, is actually a really good module if you need something a little bit simpler. So if you only need to store points, it's a good all-in-one module to handle that sort of thing. It doesn't have some of the niceties for doing slightly more complex visualizations, but for what it does do, it does, it has a nice map input widget. You can get your data out of it fairly well, that sort of thing. And then there's also the location module, which has been around for forever with Drupal and does similar things as well.
We were able to take historical data and outline specific property values.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the best application to do that?
The question is, if we wanted to highlight specific historical boundary points, what's the best way to do that? And that is a very long discussion, and I'm not sure there's a short answer for that.
Basically, you want to create some of those boundary.
Right. So using geofield, like if you wanted to do it, if you wanted to manage that data in Drupal specifically, using geofield, you could store that information and then display it out. I'm actually going to show a few tools that might be a better solution for that. One sec.
With this, I work with a cultural heritage organization and Scottish heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is, over the centuries, property rights move back and forth, and work what land, which battles, and things like that. So we're wanting to be able to do that.
Then I have the thing to show you in about 5 minutes because there's a really cool app that might work really well for you. So, sir, red shirt. Sorry, there's 2 people behind.
For exaggerated maps,
Mm-hmm.
are there tools for doing mapping? Maybe an Africa campus that isn't exactly
Like a
longitude correct?
sure. So for maps that don't specifically line up with like your typical web map projection, what are some good tools for that? So again, it kind of depends on your specific application. Talking about mapping in general is very much about data visualization, so it's thinking about like those individual cases for that. So if you're talking about like I have this map, so like if you're talking about like a campus map, are you trying to add information on top of that, or are you just trying to display that?
Potentially to map the differences, so you can take X and Y from latitude and longitude.
Okay, so like you could do like a search on it and say like I'm looking for building X. Where is that? That sort of thing. I would actually lean away from doing like a Slippy map implementation from that and look at something like D3 to do your rendering for that. Because especially if you're looking for something like I want to find building X, that's not really a geospatial problem. That's just a data, like I'm matching the building name to this kind of problem. So, I mean, D3 is a really good solution for doing that kind of stuff in general.
Like specifically, let's say you have a latitude and longitude,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a map that is not completely accurate, but has mostly accurate information. So you basically want to put X and Y on it.
Okay.
Ideas on that?
I would suggest changing your map so that it actually is accurate to X and Y, honestly, if you want to try to find it. Yeah. I mean, so the reason that I would suggest not using Slippy maps in implementations like that are because I'm probably putting words in your mouth, but you have a display of your information that you kind of like, and you want to be able to do coordinate searches based on that. And if you're tying into a tool set that does XY coordinates and like all the Slippy maps kinds of stuff, there are certain assumptions that it has to take in order to make that map work. When those assumptions go away, those tools are no longer useful or marginally useful. So if you're looking for something that will work with that current display, that's great, but then you have to build in the tools that say, okay, we're doing an XY search for everything except for this corner over here, and this corner over here is actually something else. So that's where it gets kind of tricky. So depending on your time and budget, sure, you can make that happen, but it's probably easier to make, if you wanted to tie into these other tools, like, like Openlayers and Leaflet and that sort of thing, it's probably easier to just get it all on a regular map, if that makes sense. One more.
Do any of these modules you mentioned account for topography?
The question is do any of the modules that I mentioned account for topography? And specifically, they don't. So geofield would be the closest to that because it does deal with geostorage. And you can do topography as like various shapes for that topography, but there's nothing that accounts for any sort of z variable for the height anywhere. In theory, you could probably get geofill to do that because WKT does have support for that kind of display, but it's not something that it currently does well. So with the last half of the presentation, I want to talk about a few different things. The first little bit of it is that outside of the Drupal world, there's actually a lot of really interesting tool sets for doing maps that I kind of want to expose you guys to. Most of these have some level of integration with Drupal. Thank you. And one of them doesn't have that great of integration, but it's still worth talking about. So to talk about the example, I currently live in DC, and for about the 4 months before I actually did move to DC, I was actually seriously looking at moving to New York. The reason I decided not to move to New York was that I couldn't find an apartment that was within my price point that wasn't infested with rats. So, but during the search with that, I actually came across a really interesting data set that I've hosted on GitHub. So on all my slides, I have links to everything, and then you can see where this is. I have a data set that basically has every apartment complex in the greater New York area. And so what that data set shows us is the age of it, the address, the number of floors, and the number of units in that building. And what we're going to walk through are a few different ways that we can actually show and display that information through a few different systems. The caveat that I'm going to point out is that Drupal is actually not that great at doing the actual display of that information as it currently stands. And the reason for that is that this current data set is in like the tens of thousands of display, and to try to churn all of that data out through a Drupal system is probably going to be a very heavy load on your server. So what we're going to talk through are a few different ways that we can potentially work with that outside of the Drupal ecosystem, and then maybe think about ways that if you do actually want to manage that data through Drupal, how you might go about doing that. The first tool that I'm going to talk about is Mapbox. So Mapbox is a, what's my problem? I need to display static or near static information. Excuse me. Static or near static information on a map. So what Mapbox does is allows you to create custom map tiles, both with publicly available data through OpenStreetMap and through your own data sets. And then the way that you can interact with that information and style it, it's through a language called CartoCSS. So if you've ever used Sass or anything like that, it's going to look incredibly familiar. It's the same basic syntax, a few different options and that sort of thing. And it's really easy to take that initial data set and turn it into something like this. And so what this is showing us is all the different apartments. They're colored and sized by the number of units in the building. No, I take that back. The size is the number of floors. So the bigger the circle, the number of the taller the building is, and then the color signifies the number of units. This is all. This is just a pre-rendered map, so you get all the pros and cons of that. What's nice about it is that it's just flat images, so it's incredibly fast in like a mobile setting. There's no processing or anything that has to happen. What's not great about it is that if you want to query that information in any sort of fashion, I can't, if I want to do something like show me all the units that are between 75, or all the buildings that are between 75 units and 300 units, I can't do that without completely re-rendering. So that's the caveat that comes in with that. What's that? Yeah, so with Mapbox, they do support some basic interaction with it. You'll notice the hover tooltip on the top right. When I say interaction, it's basically just I can click on it, I can hover over it, and then when I click on it, I can maybe go somewhere else. They don't really do much interaction outside of that. But it is a really awesome tool set, and you can do lots of really interesting visual displays with it. Definitely worth checking out. If you need something that is a little bit more dynamic, so like the example I said before, if you need to actually be able to say, I want to display, I want my end user to be able to actually filter through and search through my map listings. CartoDB is a really good solution for that. So CartoDB is basically a software as a service setup of a really nice geospatial stack. So they use Postgres and PostGIS as their database. They use a lot of the same rendering tools that Mapbox does for the actual data display. Thank you, sir. And has a really nice API to actually interact with that data on the client side. And so what you can get is something that's a little bit more interactive. Now my first example here is pretty indistinguishable from the Mapbox version, but what's happening is we have two layers. There's the Google Map layer, and then there's my points above it that are rendered on the fly. The way CartoDB does it, it's still just a second set of images in front, so it's still pretty fast. But because it is rendered on the fly, there is that server overhead. So depending on the scale of your data, like if you only have, a few thousand, it's no problem. If you're trying to show, like hundreds of thousands of things on a map, that might be a little bit problematic. But I do have an example. So this is from a blog post that I did a few months ago as an example for how you can actually dynamically filter this. So I can say I just want everything from Manhattan that fit within 51 to 300 units. And all the same styling and the same rules apply here. Basically, we just ping CartoDB. CartoDB returns the values back, and you have something that's actually interactive. I'll make sure that there's a link for this in the slides when we go through. If you look on if you look at the Phase 2 blog, that it's also written about over there as well. So CartoDB is a really cool tool. There are a few other tools as well. But the last 5 minutes, I kind of want to talk a little bit about just what are we looking at for the future, what are we looking at for Drupal 8 specifically, and what can you guys do if you are so inclined to get involved and to help out with that community. Like everything open source, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and it's always nice to kind of help contribute to that as well. We do have a fairly active Drupal Geo sub-community within the Drupal community. We tend to hang out on IRC Drupal-Geo a lot and kind of chat about things. We're kind of in a low point right now as far as activity, but in the next few months I'm expecting us to kind of pick up and wake up and realize that Drupal 8 might actually come out one day, and we should probably do something about it. So I'll have some links as well, but specific things that we're looking for from people, not just developers, but just anybody who has an interest in doing mapping with Drupal. Because we're probably going to have to re-architect everything anyway when it comes to Drupal 8, we're also wanting to kind of rethink what do people actually use Drupal for when we're talking about mapping. And so if you go to groups.drupal.org/mapping, there's a tab on the top of that page called User Stories. And what we're asking for people to do is to submit short snippets of what do they actually want to see Drupal do when it comes to mapping stuff, like what kinds of features. There's only like 2 or 3 that are listed right now, but I'm actually probably going to hack on it a little bit tomorrow and try to talk some people into kind of help me think, or me and others kind of think through some of those ideas. But if you have use cases that you think are interesting and viable solutions for that, thank you. Then definitely come talk to me tomorrow. Come talk to me tonight at the party. Go post stuff. It's open. It's free. It's if you have a groups.drupal.org account anyway, all the user stories are wiki, so they're very easy to edit by everybody. And the end goal is for us to kind of vote on what we think are interesting ideas, and then to try to implement like the top 5 or 10 or however many we have time for, because we like Agile, and Agile's fun. So, yes, sir.
Was that groups.drupal.org/maps?
Mapping. Sure. So again, there's more information at this URL. So it's bit.ly/169 capital I 5 capital I and N. There's a follow-up post that I wrote kind of talking about what's coming next, which kind of is some general thoughts on like architecture and how we kind of want to build out just our feature set and that sort of thing. So that's bit.ly/184 capital J, capital P, capital W, lowercase w. And again, these are all on the Phase 2 blog as well. My name is Brandon Morrison, so it's really easy to find me. I'm pretty stalkable on the internet. So you know, go check that out. If you have any questions or anything, you know, please, you know, come talk to me now. Come talk to me after. You probably don't want to talk to me actually right this second, because at 5 o'clock we are all standing at the stairs and getting our photo taken. So maybe after the photo or during the after party, and I'm going to be around for the code spread stuff tomorrow as well. So if you have any questions or just want to talk about, here's something awesome that I want to do with mapping, you know, please hunt me down. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.